Just hold your questions to the end of the event. If we have some speakers that don't quite make it on time, we might open up a question period. And then Stephen and I will be here for a little while at the close of the meeting, but I have another appointment that I got to be at around 2:30. But again, welcome, and feel free to ask any of us questions as we proceed. Our presentation coming up now is Boxwood Problems and Box Tree Moth Research outside the U.S. by Brian Kunkel from the University of Delaware. Brian, it's all yours.
All right, thanks. Yep, so we're definitely going to be running behind because we're starting later than when I was supposed to start talking. And as you all know, I won't be done until noon.
But I'm going to cut him off.
So some of our goals just I'm going to try to accomplish in the time allotted is discuss some of our common boxwood problems. Because boxwood, we're here because of the box tree moth, obviously. But there are some things that are commonly found that you've been dealing with for ages on boxwood that aren't overly necessary to treat. It depends on client desire or your desires for your plants as you go to sell them. And so boxwood psyllid, boxwood leaf miner review. Some uncommon boxwood problems. So boxwoods can get scale insects. And then so I have some of these listed: Cottony Community Taxus scale, oyster shelf scale, and prunicola scale. And then looking at box tree moth and briefly talk about how it was in Asia and then where it showed up in Europe. And then when it came to North America and what we've been doing with it in Delaware. So with that, we see the cupping, typical sign of boxwood psyllid feeding damage. It's one of the earlier springtime insect pests. So the nice thing is, I guess, if you want to look at a positive, is if you're going to be scouting your plants for boxwood psyllid and looking for that cupping on the leaves, you might as well dig a little deeper into that plant, literally, and see if you see box tree moth feeding. Because box tree moth feeding is potentially going to be quite early in the year. Could be as early as the second week in March. The reason why that's important is they're smaller caterpillars. And Bt and spinosad will work more effectively on smaller caterpillars. When is it exactly? We don't know, and so that's one of the things we'll be looking for. But you can see the boxwood psyllid feeding by the cupping, and you can see in here there's a little bit of wax. That is the lecking. You know, look closer and you can see that there's some shed skins, more lecking, and there's the animal. When it's an adult, it almost looks like a miniature cicada, but this is what it looks like as a nymph. And you can see the wing pads here to where the wings will fully develop from that point on. The eggs hatch really early. So 75 growing degree days is typically late March, early April. 139 is sometime usually in April for their peak activity. If you know a variety of boxwoods, some boxwoods are resistant. And control, if you feel it's necessary, you can use a neonicotinoid, acephate. Those are going to be easier because they have either translaminar or truly systemic properties. It's harder to get contact with 7 in the pyrethroids because the leaves are cupped, and sometimes that other foliage that's nearby covers the cup, so it's hard to get contact that you need with those. Boxwood leaf miner. It is also a really early insect pest on boxwoods. Typically, we start noticing the blisters turning that brownish color and the leaves getting really yellowed around mid-April or so. We could have border forsythia having their flower petals dropping when we are starting to have high levels of larval feeding inside. So this picture here is where I've broken up in the leaf And Nancy and I took pictures of the maggots feeding on the inside of the leaf. So you can see all these little yellowish, almost like slug-like insects. Those are the maggots feeding on an interior of a leaf. Acephate will work fine because it's translaminar, it'll move in, it'll get you control. If you do a neonicotinoid application, if you do it in the previous October, you'll have Safari in place and it'll be smoking the current year's generation without any problem. Imidacloprid takes longer to get into boxwoods, so an application in October doesn't start being really active and providing a lot of control until probably May, which is fine because around the beginning of May is when the adult, which we see here, she looks like a gnat, is seeing where she wants to lay her eggs. And so she lays her eggs, feeds on the leaf a little bit, determines if it's of quality she likes. If so, she lays eggs in the leaves, they hatch, and the larvae begin to feed sometime in May. And then they feed all summer, ceasing activity, feeding activity sometime in October, November. And so imidacloprid would be becoming active at the time that new generation is really beginning to start feeding. They both work well, but again, they're both neonicotinoids. So caution for that use is warranted, especially if you know you have flowering plants or plants visited by pollinators nearby. There are resistant varieties for boxwood leaf miner, so do you really need to treat for it? For some clients, they may want to have immaculate looking leaves, and so yeah, you need to treat. That's going to be on your experience and basis, but in terms of the health of the plant, neither psyllid or boxwood leaf miner causes serious injury to the health of the plant. Appearance wise, yes. Health, not necessarily. One of the scales, Cotton Camellia scale, we typically see this on hollies. And so I have a picture of what they will look like and some of the quote unquote damage that you can see. If you have boxwoods that are loaded with sooty mold, this would more than likely be your culprit. It doesn't get a lot of scale insects, and most of those are not soft scale or the coccids, which produce a lot of honeydew. But you would be able to turn over the boxwood leaves and you would see what look like what Tracy likes to call the cigarette butts or the cigarettes on the underside of the leaf. Those are ovisacs filled with hundreds of eggs. Now they stay on the plant for a while before they wear off, but that would be an indicator that yes, in fact, you do have Cotton Camellia scale. We typically see the egg sacs being laid down in May, and by mid-June, those eggs are hatching and moving onto the plant. Horticultural oil, insecticidal soap, neonicotinoids, the altus, which is like fluopyrodinirone. A fun word to say at parties because we'll be like, what did you say? Like, ha ha. But it's an easy one. You make your application, and this one is in relatively easy scale insect to get under control. The reason why you want to is you don't want your plants covered in sooty mold, like we see here. All this black is the sooty mold growing on the honeydew that those insects are producing. And it's very uncommon to be found on boxwood. Here is an armored scale, more difficult to control. They don't produce honeydew. They're harder to see. They're small, kind of brownish colored insects that we can see here. With the soft scale, when you pick them off, you remove the entire thing. With the armored scale, you can actually lift their covering off to see the number of eggs that they have laid under there. All these little white flecks here, they're all eggs of oyster shell scale. And then you can see the female, she tries to stay onto that plant even when you pull the top of her covering off. She tries to stay on the plant. When they are first coming out, now obviously this is on a rose, but you can see that there's like a waxy covering. Eventually that kind of wears off due to weathering events, whether it's rain or wind or whatever, and that becomes that more prominent brown. But you can see that the crawlers, all those other little specks that we have here, those are all settled crawlers. Again, targeting crawler activity is what we're going to try to do because the crawler is the easiest stage to control, and you can do it with horticultural oil, insecticidal soap, talus or distance. Talus and distance are insect growth regulators for scale. They work really well on this. Neonics, they don't work as well on armored scale because the armored scale are feeding on woody tissues, not where the neonicotinoids typically will be in abundance, which is in the phloem and phloem sieve elements and in the photosynthate that the plants are making. And so you get some control, but it depends on which neonicotinoid. Dinoteffuran tends to work better for the armored scale than imidacloprid does. There's a number of natural enemies that feed on these. And again, I got hosts listed here. You don't see boxwood. Just because boxwood's really not that common of a host for it. Scale isn't typically what we see on boxwoods. Criticola scale, this scale is horribly difficult to manage. Since I've been here, people have complained, what can we do for this particular insect? And part of the problem is it has an overlap of generations. And that makes it difficult because at any given time you'll have adults, eggs, and crawlers running about on the plant. And so regardless of what product you're using, they're really good at avoiding that application. And so there's frequently a remnant of that population that persists on the plant. Criticola scale typically likes to feed on older woods first, or the older tissues more than the newly produced tissue. This picture on the left, all this white, those are the males. So if you have, whether it's on boxwood, like I said, and then again, with hosts, you're not seeing boxwood because it's very uncommon. But on other hosts, if you see this white snowy-like substance on there and you go up and it moves and it brushes off real easy, it's either white peach scale or prunicola scale. And so then you're like, well, shit, now I got an issue. And unfortunately you do. So the reddish brown colored dates for generations, those are from work that's been done at the University of Maryland. The bluish black is stuff that's been done with the Southern Pennsylvania IPM group from back in the late 90s through early 2000s. And so UD was a part of that, as well as the University of Maryland. But if you look, Maryland, they found that the first generation was 513 grow degree days. We were seeing eggs around that time frame. Is it possible that eggs were hatching in that time frame and we missed it? Yes, it is. But to be watching for it in May through early June.
Boxwood problem. So boxwoods can get scale insects. And then so I have some of these listed, cotton really tagged scale, oyster shell scale, the great bullet scale. And then looking at box string moth and briefly talk about how it was in Asia and then where it showed up in Europe. And then when it came to North America, what we've been doing with it in Delaware. So with that, we see the cupping, typical sign of boxwood psyllid feeding damage. It's one of the earlier springtime insect pests. So the nice thing is, I guess, if you want to look at a positive, is if you're going to be scouting your plants for boxwood psyllid and looking for that cupping on the leaves, you might as well dig a little deeper into that plant, literally, and see if you see box tree moth feeding. Because box tree moth feeding is potentially going to be quite early in the year. Could be as early as the second week in March. The reason why that's important is they're smaller caterpillars. And BT and spinosad will work more effectively on smaller caterpillars. When is it exactly? We don't know, and so that's one of the things we'll be looking for. But you can see the boxwood psyllid eating by the cupping, and you can see in here there's a little bit of wax that is the lecking. You'll look closer and you can see that there's some shed skins, more lecking, and there's the animal. When it's an adult, it almost looks like a miniature cicada. But this is what it looks like as a nymph. And you can see the wing pads here, where the wings will fully develop from that point on. The eggs hatch really early. So 75 growing degree days is typically late March, early April. 139 is sometime usually in April for their peak activity. They can on a variety of boxwoods. Some boxwoods are resistant. And control, if you feel it's necessary, you can use a neonicotinoid, acephate. Those are going to be easier because they have either translaminar or truly systemic properties. It's harder to get contact with 7 in the pyrethroids because the leaves are cupped. And sometimes that other foliage that's nearby covering the cup, so it's hard to get contact. Boxwood leaf miner. It is also a really early insect pest on boxwoods. Typically, we start noticing the blisters turning that brownish color, and the leaves getting really yellow around mid-April or so. We could have border forsythia having their flower petals dropping when you're starting to have high levels of larval feeding inside. So this picture here is where I've broken up the leaf, and Nancy and I took pictures of the maggots being on the inside leaf. So you can see all these little yellowish, almost like slug-like insects. Those are the maggots being on the interior of the leaf. Acephate will work fine. If it's translaminar, we'll move in and it'll be control. You do a neonicotinoid application. If you do it in October, the previous October, you'll have safari in place and it'll be smoked in the current year's generation without any problem. Midichloprid takes longer to get into boxwoods. So an application in October doesn't start being really active in providing a lot of control until probably May, which is fine because around the beginning of May is when the adult, which we see here, she looks like a gnat, is seeing where she wants to lay her eggs. So she lays her eggs, feeds on the leaf a little bit, determines if it's of quality she likes. If so, she lays eggs in the leaves, they hatch, and the larvae get to feed sometime in May. And then they do all summer, ceasing activity, feeding activity sometime in October, November. And so midichloprid would be becoming active at the time that new generation is really beginning to start feeding. They both work well, but again, they're both there that so caution for that use is warranted, especially if you know you have flowering plants or plants visited by pollinators nearby. There are resistant varieties for boxwood leaf miners if you really need to treat for it. For some clients, they may want to have immaculate looking leaves, and so yeah, you need to treat. That's going to be on your experience and basis. But in terms of the health of the plant, neither psyllid or boxwood leaf miner causes serious injury to the health of the plant. Appearance wise, yes. Health, not necessarily. One of the scales, kind of camellia scale, we typically see this on hollies. And so I have a picture of what they will look like and some of the quote unquote damage that you can see. If you have boxwoods that are loaded with sooty mold, this would more than likely be your culprit. It doesn't get a lot of scale insects, and most of those are not soft scale or the coccids, which produce a lot of honeydew. But you would be able to turn over the boxwood leaves and you would see what it looked like what Tracy likes to call the cigarette butts or the cigarettes on the underside of the leaf. Those are ova sacs filled with hundreds of eggs. Now they stay on the plant for a while before they wear off, but that would be an indicator that yes, in fact, you have cotton candy scale. We typically see the egg sacs being laid down in May, and then by mid-June, those eggs are patching with the plant. Horticultural oil, insecticidal. So, neonicotinoids, the altus, which is like fluopyridine. Fun word to say at party because we'll be like, what is that? But it's an easy one. You make your application, and this one is in relatively easy scale insect to get under control. The reason why you want to is you don't want your plant covered in sooty mold, like we see here, all this black. It's a sooty mold growing on the honeydew that those insects would produce. And it's very uncommon to be found on boxwood. Here is an armored scale, more difficult to control. They don't produce honeydew. They're harder to see. They're small, like a brownish colored insects that we can see here. With the soft scale, when you pick them off, you remove the entire thing. The armored scale, you can actually lift their covering off to see the number of eggs that they have laid under there. All these little white flecks here that are all eggs of oyster shell scale. And then you can see the female, she tries to stay onto that plant even if you pull the top off her covering off. She tries to stay on the plant. When they are first coming on, obviously it's on a rose, but you can see that there's like a waxy covering. Eventually that kind of wears off due to weathering events, whether it's rain or wind or whatever, and that becomes that more prominent brown. But you can see the crawlers, all those other little specks that we have here, those are all settled crawlers. Again, targeting crawler activity is what we're going to try to do because the crawler is the easiest stage to control. And you can do it with horticultural oil, insecticidal soap, talus or distance, talus and distance or insect growth regulators for scale. They work really well on this. Neonics, they don't work as well on armored scale because the armored scale is feeding on living tissues, not where the neonicotinoids typically will be in abundance, which is in the phloem and phloem sieve elements, and then the photosynthetic that the plant can make. So you get some control, but it depends on which neonicotinoid. Dinotefuran tends to work better for the armored scale than imidacloprid does. There's a number of natural enemies that feed on these. And again, I got hosts listed here. You don't see boxwood because boxwood's really not that common of a host for it. If you don't, scale isn't typically what we see on box. For the cola scale, this scale is horribly difficult to manage. It's since I've been here, people have complained, what can we do to this particular insect? And part of the problem is it's an overlap of generations. And that makes it difficult because at any given time you have adults, eggs, crawlers running about on the plant. And so regardless of what product you're using, they're really good at avoiding that application. And so there's frequently a remnant of that population that persists on the plant. Because some of those scales typically like to feed on older woods first, or the older tissues more than newly produced tissue. This picture on the left, right, sorry, all this white, those are the males. So if you have, whether it's on boxwood, like, and then again, with hosts, you're not seeing boxwood because it's very uncommon. But on other homes, if you see this white snowy like substance on there, you go up and it moves and it brushes off real easily. It's either white peach scale or prunicola scale. And so then you're like, well, shit, now I got this. And unfortunately. So the reddish brown colored dinks for generations, those are from work that's been done at the University of Maryland. The bluish black is stuff that's been done with the Southern Pennsylvania IPM group from back in the late 90s through early 2000s. And so UD was a part of that, well, the University of Maryland. But if you look, Maryland, they found that the first generation was 513 grow degree days. We were seeing eggs around that time frame. Is it possible that eggs were hatching in that time frame and we missed it? Yes, it is. But to be watching for it in May through early June is what the goal would be for the first generation. With this insect, much like with box tree moth, if you're able to have your big impact with the first generation, the second and third generations or the future generations are smaller and easier to deal with than if you miss the first one, then you're dealing with a ton of insects. Which if you knock them, kick them in the teeth when they're starting out, they're much easier to deal with. And so with this particular insect, it has a generation in the middle of the summer. And then again in the fall, once everybody feels like they've managed everything, and they kind of are on the done with this stage, the insect still isn't, and it keeps on going. Again, it's a insecticidal soap, horticultural oil, if you're able to target the grower or the crawler stage, work fantastic. Talus and distance, they work well as well also with targeting that crawler stage. They'll work on adults, but they're growth regulators, meaning they don't allow the insect to complete development properly. So they're going to work best on immatures. And so anything that's targeting that egg to crawler activity time frame is going to give you your better control. The insect growth regulators, talus and distance, will have longer residual than insecticidal soap or horticultural oil. The growth regulators will have a few weeks of activity, whereas the oil and soap is only like a day and a half. They're all more friendly in terms of the impacts they have upon that environment. What we have is pictures here of looking at the prunicola scale. You got an adult female. She's producing eggs. If she does that, she's dead. She dies. Here you have a male talking to a female, planning on getting together. That usually results in this. And then you have what happens when we make an insecticide application that's successful. Here we see females that have consumed some of that insecticide. This was a dinotetraran application. We flipped over the covers like we see here. And we see they're all brown and they're starting to dry up. It's an indicator that they are dead. We did a treatment 2 summers ago, looking at aerial applications with a drone in a nursery. And we compared it to mainspring to talus. And what we found when we flipped over covers, counting live and dead, we found the untreated had over 300 establishing and growing scale insects per tree. And we had less than 10 in both the talus and mainspring applications. So there's some, and mainspring is a diamide. So it has got a much more favorable worker safety protection signal word associated with it. Risk to applicators is less because its mode of action does not have target anything that we have work specifically on insects. So that a better product. From a hazard sort of point, and it is highly effective. All right, box tree moth. Wasting half the time on the cards rarely there. So in Asia is where it's come from. China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, that sort of area. It has anywhere between 2 and 5 generations, depending where. Boxwoods that are from that region of the world that have encountered the box tree moth. It's not a pest in Asia, partly because those boxwoods have evolved over time to produce compounds that make it more difficult for the box tree moth to be able to be developed. The other thing is there's natural enemies over there that feed on the caterpillar that help keep it suppressed to where it's not that big of a pest. It still can have 2 to 5 generations, depending where you're at in Asia. Its developmental threshold is anywhere between 9.5 and 10.5 degrees centigrade. Does everybody know what that is? Yeah, me either. To get to that. I mean, I can figure it out, but I'll get to that. The reason why I mentioned that here in a minute. So it can have basically it can either develop below 50 degrees, meaning it's very cold tolerant, so it will do well here, or it can tolerate hot or warmer temperature as a baseline. So depending on where this population that we have came from, will help determine its activity and how we can better pinpoint our management efforts. So it was in Europe 2007. It was a horrible problem. It came over into North America and Canada in 2018. They put quarantining a lot of management efforts. And one of the ways of moving is through nursery stock. In Europe, that's not their issue. I'll be that at the moment. New York, 2021 showed up, and in the Michigan and in Ohio, we joined the club, as Jeff mentioned, in 2024. And then last year, Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia joined the club. I'm not going to go a whole lot through its life cycle. I'm going to show a little bit, talk a little bit about it. That way, Alejandro is running a little bit late. We can't cover everything. I'm figuring we can give you more information. The eggs are laid and then they hatch within 3 days. And they will feed. They'll go from egg pupa within about 14 days. And then when they pupate, about 14 days later, they'll be adults. And then within a few days after being adults, they'll start laying eggs. So going from egg, one generation, to the next, depending on temperatures and microclimates, can take, between 30 and 40 days. So with that being said, it has been hypothesized that we could have 2 to 3 generations in a year for Delaware. Most people are saying probably 2, but depending, we're staying warmer longer into the fall. And so that could give us an opportunity for, not that we want it, but there could be an opportunity for a 3rd generation. They overwinter in some studies as 4th or 5th instars. What I've mostly seen in Europe is that they're saying that it's 3rd to 4th, and usually 3rd, but they can be in the 4th. And there's been different ways that they've tried to ascertain what stage the caterpillars are in the field, comparing that to lab-reared insects.
Brian, where on the plant did they overwinter? In the leaf litter or on the plant?
Not in the litter, they're on the plant. So in Europe, we can see here we got 2008 in France, 2007 in the Netherlands, 2007 Germany, 2008 in England. So it's been moving through Europe. And I mentioned it's predominantly moving in nursery stock. Well, in Europe, in their forests, they have boxwoods that are native there. So they have boxwoods in their forest of different sizes, shapes, varieties. It's able to use those as corridors to go to different locations. So it's much harder for them to deal with box tree moth than us. Luckily for us, we don't have native boxwoods to worry about out there from which it's not an invasive plant. So it's not springing up in random places out in riparian areas or forests in the Appalachian Mountains. It's where we're putting it. And so that is how we're going to potentially limit where it spreads, because it is dominantly a boxwood feeder. There's been work that says that's been done in Asia and in Europe that there's potential for alternative hosts. But from what I was reading a manuscript for from a master's student in Canada. And they were saying that it looks like those alternative hosts are really ineffective food materials when you get out in the real world. And so they're going to be all that was what I was getting from what I was reading their stuff. And so this is just a map of the distribution of where it is, all the numbers and the years in which they got into the particular country. And what they're typically seeing in places like Switzerland, they're having about 2 generations a year. Italy, regardless of where you're at, in the eastern half, they're seeing two generations. In the western half, they're seeing 3. So it's not hard set that this is what it's only going to be until you get somewhere like in the Switzerland where they're pretty confident that they have 2 generations. England thinks that they have 2 generations. In Europe, they feel that they have it nailed down pretty well, that the development threshold is 9.5 degrees centigrade. It's about 47 degrees, somewhere in that range. We normally, with our growing degree days, typically start monitoring at 50, where we don't keep track of thermal units for insect development below 50 degrees. And so, since this has a development threshold below 50, we're missing some of that activity period the insect could be using to develop outside our normal watchfulness. If it's a European-based company. In Japan and Asia, they're using 10.5, which is a little warmer than 50 degrees. And so which population are we pulling from? We don't. So when we look at EdMaps, which is a site that has arthropod pest distributions listed, the site's hosted by University of Delaware or University of Georgia, and you can report information to them where you find pests. I pulled this off last night. Added in here, you can see this area in green. That's where they have documented finds of box tree moth. The ones that are missing are here in Delaware, Pennsylvania. From my impression, it was near Erie. It's up in the northwest corner. And then West Virginia, Maryland, Virginia is where all those 3 states kind of come together. So no surprise that if we're going to find all 3 of them at once, it's going to be an area where they're all in close proximity. In Europe, what we're seeing is what they have is their 2 generation. This is their life cycle. They have put together and they have on their website, which I have listed down here. They have additional information and videos if you wanted to visit that. But we have where they're believing they have the beginning of their activity in the spring, in March or April. And then the insect feeds and develops on the plant. What it does when those eggs hatch, they're typically laid on the interior portions of a boxwood. Those eggs hatch, they feed on the interior. And then they make their way out. So any insecticide applications you're making have to get to the inside of the plant. Otherwise, you're going to have less effective control efforts. And we don't want to be less effective because that's lost money. And so they have to penetrate through the canopy of that plant. And so they continue to feed, eventually make their way out, and you'll see the browning out of tissue, webbing, and frass, and I'll show a picture of that in a moment. They're saying that they have their adults come out in June, lay eggs, and then they're recommending 4 potential windows of treatment. Those would be between the 10th and 15th of July, the 16th and 20th of August, 13th through the 18th of September. And then the final to hit that overwintering group of caterpillars to hit it no later than the 15th of October. And so what are they saying to use? One of their recommendations is Bacillus thuringiensis Gerstocki, or BT. Is one of the ones that they're suggesting people use. Pyrethrum. So it's the more naturally derived insecticide, or the synthetic pyrethroids. This window up here in April, March, April, they're saying scout your plants, look at those, see what you got. Hopefully, you kill it off the overwintering, which I thought was cool. They put there sleeping, so that you're hitting most of that, and you have very little here. This is some work that was done out of Switzerland. We got 2 pukes. So 2/6 looks like it's February 6th. It's not. Europeans are fine. They like to put their day before the month. So that's the 2nd of June. 16th of June, they're seeing and this is with adult flights using pheromone traps. And so they start collecting these males essentially in between. So we got June 30th or 23rd of June through July, kind of drops off and then picks up around the end of August and continues in some form or fashion into October. And so this is in Switzerland. They're putting up in 2 generations. In Italy, this is from one of the papers where I said, one of the locations in Italy, pretty much corresponded with this, where they were seeing 2 generations starting in July and again in September. And this other paper had it starting as early as May 27th. And from talking to Steve, he had caught, and correct me if I'm wrong, caught adults in the middle of May last year.
The first time we saw adults, like we saw adults on shrubs on like the 19th.
Okay,
of May.
so again, middle of May, 19th of May, you've seen adults on shrubs. So since that's when we're seeing it, it's possible that we actually have these 3 generations. And we're not 100% sure, but that's what it's looking like it could. And so one of the tools that we have available for us is predicting larval activity timeframes. Here we have, so larval activity in the spring in Europe has been shown to begin after we hit consistent 10 degrees centigrade temperatures. When is that for us? So when you look at Dover, Kent County, they have different ways that they try to come up with that, and I went for the past 2 years. So they said that we had our first 10-degree centigrade day in January, my birthday, in 2024, and then at the end of February in 2025. For a week of where we've had consistent 10-degree temperatures, it was the 9th of March or the 17th of March in 2024-25. So early March, we're getting days that are potentially in the 50s. And that's a week prediction where we're going to have consecutive days of 10 degrees centigrade in a row. When it occurred was March 15th, that week in 2024, and then March 31st in 2025. So basically, this is suggesting we're going to have caterpillar activity in March. So if you're growing boxwoods, scout your boxwoods, or if you're managing boxwoods in the landscape, scout them in March, because that's when those caterpillars are going to be coming along. Now, what we're trying to do in Delaware, we're hoping to partner with Maryland and Virginia Tech at some point, is to get a better handle of what's occurring in the mid-Atlantic. And so I have proposal right now to where we're going to try to evaluate the different sites throughout the state when spring activity begins and when it ends in fall. And so we have adult box tree moth models available for us to kind of get predictions. So here you can look at growing degree days for 24 and 25. They're pretty close until you get to the end of the year. And then 24 was a little warmer than last year. But predicting when they're going to be active, this was the 17th of May, so close to when you had mentioned. And what they were saying is that we should have adult emergence in the next 30 days. When you had actually seen, we'd already had adult emergence. And so it wasn't quite accurate, which is, again, another reason why we want to go ahead and look at this closer. Because if in Italy, from one side of the country to the other, they're having a difference in generations, going from New York down to us, mid-Atlantic, could have different numbers of generations. New York may only have 2, but we could have 3. And so we need to look at that. So I have here, and I'll go ahead and pass these and that one. If you look at the leaf, there's some things on there. Those are the eggs. And so they're yellowish in coloration, and as the caterpillar gets close to hatching out, you'll see the head capsule. It's really dark. And so they're hard to see. And then over here, we've got some early feeding of the caterpillar that has come out to the edge. This is an example of how you may just barely start to see some browning of the boxwood that's in there. You go in and pull that foliage apart, look close. You could see their fecal pellets, the brass, and it could be attached or hanging on with the plant by webbing that's here. That's one way you can tell that you've had box tree moth feeding. If you see that your leaves are being consumed, we don't have caterpillars that typically feed on boxwoods in the United States. So some of the leaves are being eaten, but the outer edge of the leaf is remaining behind. That is a sign of box tree moth feeding. They will cause the window painting on leaves, or they will scratch the upper epidermis of the leaf and cause patches like we see here when they're small. Here's a caterpillar, second installer, in here that's been feeding. They web those leaves together and sit down in there. Here you can see where the feeding that says later in the year. Substantial damage on this boxwood here and here. They'll strip the plant of the leaves. And once the leaves are gone, they will start feeding on the bark and they'll girdle branches and whatnot as they're feeding on the actual stems themselves. Boxwoods can recover from an initial feeding. They'll reflush, put out new leaves. But they can only do that so many times because it's taking their energy reserves away from the plant. Once your energy reserves are gone, you can't replenish, which means you can't make food and you end up dying. So other examples, this is feeding on the underside, and you see some of the silken webbing that's got the frass from early instar stuck to it. Again, upper leaf feeding. The caterpillars can get out to be about 1.5 inches in size. So big caterpillars, when they're later instars, they blend in well with the foliage. So it just takes vigilance and watching for the insect if you're looking for the caterpillar. in monitoring with pheromone traps is an option to know when the adult males are flying. And so that you know that they are out and could have caterpillars soon, eating soon. So you should make an application potentially start it early in the program. One of the things that said or in literature is that for them to overwinter, it occurs with day length. Day length, they said they start making their hibernacula or their overwintering structure was spurred by day length between 14.2 and 13.5 hours of daylight. I'm like, oh, that would be really cool. Know what night it is. So I had online and looked, and for Dover, 13.5 hours of daylight, that's occurring in August. So if it's occurring in August, we may not have 3 generations because we're getting into, by the end of August, we've got 13 hours, 6 minutes of daylight. So they should start forming that hibernacula at that point if daylight is truly the driver of what Moth is over the winter. When we see, so the other thing is you have head capsules. This paper here in Combo, they're in Switzerland. They gathered the caterpillars from the field and compared it to a colony leg. They reared caterpillars individually in cups, let them feed, and every time they wanted, they measured their head capsule. And then they compared what they saw out in the field when they gathered the caterpillars, brought them in, and measured their head capsule. And what they found was that the 3rd and 4th instars were between 1 and 1.5, maybe 2 millimeters in width. This is totally fun to do. I mean, I suggest everybody get a scope and try to look at the caterpillar head and measure it with a ruler. It's a ton of fun. In fact, I'm surprised I'm still alive today because my intern was like going to measure all of these. So I had that calculator. I'll show you in a second. But remember, so 2, 2nd, the 3rd instar, Switzerland was saying they're in the 3rd instar when they're over the limb. Japan was saying 2 to 4. And so basically, if it's 2nd instar or 4th instar, it may have a head capsule that's 2 millimeters wide. There's another picture that looked at mass, and we took mass measurements on or weight. Still working through that data to see how that matches up in comparison. But they in other parts of Europe are seeing 3rd and 4th instars as well. There are some in Asia that say as large as 5th instar. Those are going to be larger cats, starting to get closer to 3. And so day length flies, I started seeing initially a hibernacula here and there, very uncommon when we get to hours, 12 hours points. And started seeing more together as well. By October 3rd, it was really hard to find caterpillars. And I had talked to Steve, and he had said sometime in September, October, they started having a difficult time finding caterpillars. I found out, or I have suspicions as to why that is. But 11 hours, 43 minutes. And then Friday, October 10th, 11 hours, 26 minutes. That's where I started seeing a much more common occurrence in the hibernacula in the site that I was looking at. Now, unfortunately, I only had time to go to one location. What I'd like to do and what we've proposed in the submission that I put in last year is to multiple locations so we get a broader picture. This is just a snapshot of what we saw. And so, but it gives us a guideline on where we can try to focus our efforts here in the future. So potentially in this time frame in October is when they're making their hibernacula. We're seeing it about 50% to 3/4 of the population were making hibernaculas by the 10th of October. And so when we were doing our head capsule measurements, we were seeing head capsules greater than 2 millimeters all the way out until around the end of October or end of August. And we started seeing some fluctuation in our smaller caterpillar population. Get into September, and it switches from being large caterpillars to mostly little caterpillars or smaller caterpillars. And by the 26th of September, we're starting to see even the small caterpillar sizes decrease. And that's because as they're hibernacula, they take those leaves, pull them in a nice little triangular pattern and wall it up. And that's how they make their hibernacula. And they're hard to find plant. So when you're starting to have a higher number of hibernacula, you're not finding as many caterpillars. And at the same time, I believe we were starting to have, back in here, we were having more adults show up and laying eggs. And so we were starting to have that overwintering generation show up. So examples of some of the plants I was working with by October. This one's, this one I think is going to be close to done, mostly brown. It might flush this spring, but if it suffers just that damage again, I would suspect it'd be dead by the end of this year. This is what the hibernacula kind of looks like. It's almost like a window to the world that the caterpillar uses. It pulls the leaves to surround it so it's protected. And then this is water resistant. Water doesn't penetrate through that very well. So one of the reasons why we want to know when to make that application is so that we can hit them while they're small in the fall before they put the protective window up. Because with that window up, our product isn't getting to them. They're just sitting back there eating their popcorn, boxwood leaf, laughing at our outbreaks, and they'll be back in the spring. And we don't know when they start feeding in the spring. If you have suspected finds of boxwood moth, you can contact Cooperative Extension. I have the locations and numbers listed. Again, Master Gardeners reported it. I was on vacation, so they didn't stop. They kept going to make sure they found out what the problem was. And so contacting Master Gardeners and Cooperative Extension, any of these numbers, or in those locations, or you could drop it off at Townsend Hall, where Jill has her clinic that she runs with them. I'm sure over time. But
Well, since we started late, if you want to take a couple of questions, you can, and then Stephen can get his presentation ready.
okay. So here's the other thing. If you can see the edges of the boxwood leaves, how there's those strands. One of the things that caterpillar does is leave the outer edge of the leaf behind. As you have in the dust making. And again, they feed on the outside, inside, out. And so we have to get our products in place. Europe is using mostly tea and pyrite fluids like bipentrin, pyrite fluids. We have the nose and an option to use as well. The Celloprint or chlorine. It's a fantastic caterpillar product. It has pretty good residual length. I tried keeping a population going out in the field on the sulfur treated plants, and it didn't spot. I put over 50 out there. See, 30, I put probably 120 caterpillars on boxwoods that have been treated with the sulfur. It didn't make it. So, I wasn't surprised, but it was good.
Do you have more slides? Okay. Brian was serious about him eating the bark after they defoliate the leaves.
It's quite brutal.
Not a joke.
It's become really brutal. When it's been defoliated and they start feeding on it, I would remove the plants and just dry it out.
Any questions?
You say it's mostly traveling by nursery stock and everything like around here. Do you know how far it travels from property to property?
It can fly up to 10
Can you
kilometers.
repeat the question just for? the-
Okay, yeah, so
Thank you.
moves, the question was, so moves a nursery stock from location to location, how far will it move from property to property, correct?
Yes.
So the adult moths can fly up to 10 kilometers. And so, and they're good, which means they're good flyers. And so 10 kilometers, is around up to 6 miles. And so they're very good at dispersing. And so, and to that point, I got reports from my naturalists and USDA saying, hey, can you look at these trap locations where foreign earworm pheromone traps were pulling in the box tree moth? Would you look, see if there are additional spots where these moths would pull? And I was given like 4 or 5 locations. My intern and I went and spent a little over a day looking at these additional locations where other traps had found them. We found boxwood, but no sources of box tree moth. And then when we went back and looked where we were doing some of our data collection, which was within 6 miles of where we were doing our work. So it's highly possible that pheromone traps that were in these farming communities near where we were working were pulling the moths over there. Yeah.
Brian, question for the industry is when you go to a client's house, you are doing a first day spring cleanup, and with them being in this hibernation at this time of year, and they're being disrupted, and you picking up your clippings, and then you take the clippings and you go to the next spot. If they're not quite in that hibernation and they're becoming active, in reality, could the worm potentially work its way off and work its way onto a property that does not have it? Being that a juvenile to an adult worm being transported as the industry is going around and making Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones and so yada yada yada's properties all look nice early in the spring. Should the industry be conscious of transporting boxwood clippings from site to site to site? Could we potentially be moving it that way?
So the question is it possible to move box tree moth from location to location via clippings and immature capital?
Basically,
Yeah. Okay. And so I would say that would be a less likely way, but not entirely impossible. The way I would imagine it's like if you're pruning up damaged boxwoods and you take the clippings and are removing them and you have them in a chipper box before you chip it and you stop it.
Can I get a chipper box?
Well, whatever, but you get what I'm saying, put it in the back of your truck. And you go down to a couple other properties, those clippings that have to fall out near boxwood, the caterpillars be able to fall in. So, or you would have to take the clippings and accidentally drop them at the base of other boxwoods so that they'd be able to come out of that hibernacula and move to another boxwood. If you take a clipping and leave the clippings at the base of your boxwoods, or your boxwoods are here and your compost pile is over here by Jeff, you could potentially have caterpillars who make it back to boxwoods. Or if you had boxwoods here that were uninvested and your clipping piles there, sure, they could potentially make that distance. It just would make a lot of challenges to do that. Natural enemies for one, desiccation, actually finding the boxwoods from there because they're small. I mean, 1.5 inches is small, but when they're in the hibernacula, they're not 1.5 inches. They might be a half.
It's just with the spring cleanups leaving coming,
Right.
and this potential that, May 19th, we're finding adults.
Right.
When the cleanup in March is going on, we're outside of that hibernacula. And these companies are going to be out there and we potentially will have half-inch worms.
Yep.
And the other reason that this came up is dealing with the customers that getting reports of outbreaks very far from where there's already known outbreaks. And this is my own conclusion is are we as an industry potentially pushing it out faster?
Well, so for those that aren't diligent, so if you're doing your spring cleanup, whether it's in a nursery or in a landscape, that's where you need these scouts if you have high ground. The debris, those plants need to be treated. If they're not being treated, then yes, you are. Because you're allowing them to develop adulthood to fly that 4 or 5 miles to another property that has boxwood.
Gotcha.
So if you're doing a cleanup on boxwoods, get in there and look and see if you have box tree moth. Because if you don't, then it's possible that they develop and fly somewhere else. I wouldn't necessarily say it's from your clippings necessarily. I would say you missed caterpillars that are making it to develop it to adult.
Just
stage.
trying to stay ahead of the curve
Yep.
as much as we can.
Yep. So scouting becomes very important. Because I mean, if you're doing a spring cleanup and they're hibernaculate, then you're already there when they're present in a vulnerable stage waiting to come out. If you pay attention, you would be able to be like, okay, these plants at property X, Y, or Z has boxwood, the mechanical a residual systemic product out like a sulfur. I could put a residual product out like spinosad if the client doesn't want to spend as much as the sulfur product application may cost. Spinosad would give you a couple of weeks of residual activity. BT, it's not gonna go through the hibernacula and it's gonna go on, unless it comes out later that day or within a day or so, it's gonna be inactivated to where it won't work as well, if at all, as a residual treatment. Might be a week, maybe. But I'm much more confident in a BT application that's applied when you have small pests there. Than relying on. Spinosad, you can look. Yep.
Slides available.
I mean, we can make them available.
Tracy, did you hear that?
Yeah. Yeah, if everybody wants them, I can send them as a PDF.